start off, just jump right in. And we are going to start with the legal mapping process. And so the legal mapping process, Rebecca and I kind of talked about it, and the legal epidemiology framework is going to be, as Isla said, the umbrella. And underneath the legal epidemiology framework is going to be the legal mapping process. And it's going to show how the policies have changed over time and how they vary across jurisdictions or institutions.
All right, and then this slide, maybe. This was what I was talking about earlier, Shelley, when I said that we had kind of a tiered approach, right? So under legal epidemiology, there's policy surveillance, which we will talk about a little bit, but that's when you look at policies in variations over time. So the iterations of policy, which we'll talk a little bit about, not a ton, which maybe we didn't skip those slides, right? And then there's also legal assessment, which is more what we're going to be looking at, because we're looking at just one point in time. We're not looking at the iterations, the versions of a law. We're just looking at how they stand at one pinpointed time. And then there's public health law practice, which involve legal scans and legal profiles. But this is kind of the entity at B. So legal epidemiology is the practice. I forget, Sue just said it, but, and then these are the things that are within it. But like they were saying, this is kind of a terminology thing, talking about very similar things. I personally think legal mapping is easier to understand, get people to wrap their minds around. So if that's what the terminology we're using, then I think we should use it.
Where's public health law research fit in this framework?
It all, I think this would be considered public health law research, yes.
I mean,
Falls underneath.
And then this one is just kind of a different, I know people learn differently. So the first one is kind of a simplified version. This is more of a version that shows you the breakdown of what models you'd use and what you'd use it for. This is really just, I put it in here for the future if you're looking back through these slides. I think this just helps if this is the way your brain works, which it might not work for everyone, but yeah, Shelley's giving me a thumbs up, I agree. That helps me, but just as an idea of kind of breaking down the different ways that you use what. So if you can see, like, the legal scan is more of a quick scan of a topic, right? We're not looking in as deeply to maybe the health we're not correlating it with the health outcomes. We're just looking at the current status of the law at one point in time.
Okay, and here is the legal mapping process. There's going to be 8 different steps that we will be going through. We have already been working on 1 and 2. So defining the scope, we've been narrowing it down. We went with public water systems, and now we're narrowing the topic even further by selecting the 3 subcategories. And then once we have defined the scope and narrowed it as much as we can, we will continue to do the additional background research.
Yeah, and just one thing I'll note here is I wanted to, like, we are really in 1, but we're in 2 as well. As we were saying, right, we're having these meetings with the cultural and environmental departments within the Pueblos counties, all of this stuff, right? We're starting to really get a grasp and an understanding of what the landscape of these issues look like. But we're gonna have to do more. And a lot of which we'll get into, right, of this conducting the background research, really make sure that we're using the right terminology when we are going to search the laws, and ensuring that we have all the as much information as we can get, of course, right, on the way. But this is kind of, this is the wheel of our project. And this is the sequence we'll follow. We'll come back to it a few times throughout this presentation, but yeah.
So where does the health impact data come into this?
That would be when we're looking at, so we have to think about that when we're developing the coding questions, because that's the information we're trying to get out of the law to compare to the health outcome information. Conducting the background research will also include looking at the health outcomes of the laws that we're talking about, making sure we're getting the correct data, that we can find the data before we go to the point of coding the law. But coding the law will ask what we're trying to get out of it, right? So what we're looking to assess, and that will have to be strongly informed by the health, by what health data we're trying to compare it to, right? And then also when it comes to like the dissemination and publication, right? We have to code these laws using the codes that we made up, or the questions we made up, and then compare them to the health outcome data at the end. So pretty much the bulk of this is looking at the law and executing it and looking, because, and I will say that a lot of this process has to do with the law, has to do with the policies we're looking at. So that's these 4 here. It's gonna deeply involve the law. And then we're looking at we need to address the health outcomes when we're conducting the background research, when we're looking at the coding questions, and then when we have the end goal of the law, we've coded it, then we compare it to the health outcome data that we've already decided on at the beginning. Does that make sense? Or
I mean, I hear you, I guess, when we talk, it's interesting to me that the health, as I heard, is a core part of legal epidemiology, that the health outcomes are not explicit. I understand that we're looking at the intersection. We are looking at the intersection, and Isla's still here and she's raising her hand.
oh, perfect. I'd love to hear from Isla. Go ahead.
Oh, okay.
There is so much overlap in practice with the vocabulary, but if it's at all helpful, I like to think of the legal mapping as the part of the half of the process. So this is collecting the legal data. And if the end goal is to do a full evaluation comparison with the health data, that it's obviously going to be informing what's happening in the legal side, but legal mapping's the legal side. And then you have, if you're doing a whole new collection of the health data, or if you're generating it from someplace else, you're going to have that component of the research. And then there's going to be another research project on how do you compare the two. So I look at legal mapping as kind of one of the steps that might be happening in concurrently or before or after the health data part.
That makes complete sense to me. So is this a comprehensive picture of what we're doing? What you're calling legal mapping?
I don't think so. It's really just
The process.
yeah, and I would say this is the legal process, right? Of if we are in a bit of this funk with this grant where the changing of the policy and all of that is something we're adding into it, right? Like it's not under this funding. So this is really to give you the process of a lot of the legal work we're going to be doing, this aspect of it, and then we have to additionally add. This is in our project outline, right? This is the progress of the legal aspect of the grant that we're doing.
Yes.
But they have to be happening and like intertwining,
Yes.
like, right, like we have to be collecting this. But it's hard to move forward with that next step before, not with this, but you know, like they have to be defined to be able to ask the right questions, to look for the right data, to look at the laws, right? But I will say this presentation is primarily talking about the legal mapping process, does not have much involved with the also collecting the health outcome information.
Okay, so why use legal mapping? So, you know, as was spoken before, it's going to be to track the particular law. You know, legal mapping uses a question and answer format, you know, also known as the Q&A format. Even with a large complex policy assessment, the Q&A format makes it easy for many different audience to understand the data. And so this is just going to show an example of how we track law over time. You know, the legal mapping can help us track those changes over time. So you can see that, you know, initially in 1996, there was only one state that utilized the state with texting and driving laws, and then it moves, you know, through. You can see in 2005 there was more states involved, and then by 2015 there was only one state that wasn't included. So this is just, an example.
Go Montana. They don't have a speed limit either.
Yeah. But this is just, and that one's not, that's not what we're gonna do.
No,
But just to give you an idea of like why you would, right, and why maybe Montana, doing something like this could show you why Montana needs some help. Right? But this is just kind of a way of, I think it was helpful to me to kind of understand why you would do something like this, why you would track it over time.
right.
Good, great.
And then this one is, so it talks about, and I don't think we need to go into this a ton because we talked about it earlier with
Right.
why we're looking at the law, why it's important to look to the law. We developed this presentation thinking we had to help make that connection of law and health, but this is just kind of an example of when you're looking along the interstate, maybe you're wondering to yourself why exit 189 has a life expectancy rate of 87, while down here at exit 132 only has a life expectancy rate of 75. What's happening is there anything happening within the law across those two jurisdictions that could be impacting the life expectancy rate? Which this just breaks it down to show you a little farther.
And so we're gonna just follow Wendy along as an example, you know, how we're gonna go through this process. So, she wants to know how distracted driving laws in her jurisdiction impact public health. The two neighboring states just passed a distracted driving law that regulates drivers' cell phone use while they drive. Her bosses asked her to determine whether distracted driving laws have affected health outcomes since they were first passed. And so her hypothesis is going to be strict bans on texting while driving have a positive effect on public health. So she needs to borrow from the scientific method and move from a hypothesis to a conclusion that is based in evidence. And so just like Wendy, she's gonna choose the legal mapping, and she's going to look across 25 jurisdictions where we are gonna be looking across 6 jurisdictions. And so while she's, gonna go through this legal mapping, she has to assemble a team in order to tackle this process. And, the team consists of 2 members, that should be able to conduct the legal research. Let's see, and so what we have done is put together a team already. So you don't have to put a team together, that's what CCHICA has done for you. So we have Sue with Pyre, we have Isla, who we just partnered with, who's gonna help us a lot with the tribal health councils. And Sue has 20 years of experience. And we also have New Mexico Voices, we have NMPHA for Public Health and Policy Insight. So your team has already been established and taken care of for you.
And you can always add to it.
Yeah.
But I think the biggest thing is that we don't want you to take away that you need to find these teams in yourself, right? The team is consistent of the project, not that you need this team on your own, in your own health council.
Absolutely. And it helps to take away from the overwhelming feeling when you see this legal mapping process. This is not something that you will be tackling alone. So we just wanted to reiterate that the legal mapping is a non-linear process. However, the process does follow some general steps. And there are 8 steps that we had talked about, and we're already working on 1 and 2. So as we start moving through all of these different steps, as we continue to go through, there's going to be certain steps that you will not be participating in the sense that it require to code the law. That's something that Rebecca and I will do, and we'll just keep going through the different steps and let you know who's going to be in, doing what.
Yeah, the key role you play in
Yes.
that stuff. But what I will say is to really highlight the non-linear process, right? So we have been told on repeat that it is not uncommon in the legal epidemiology process and the legal mapping process to have to step back to stages that maybe you've already passed, right? So maybe we really feel like we've decided to find the scope and that we're ready, we've conducted all the research we can, and we're developing those coding questions, but they're not coming out. Or maybe we even got to developing the coding questions, we go to start collecting the law. Nothing's coming up with the words we're using, nothing's coming, like, right, like, we're not getting the laws out the way that we think we should. It's not working. We have to go back. We have to conduct more background research. One example they gave us on a training the other day was they were looking at like the, what are they called? I'm already blanking. But basically making sure you're using the right terminology, which I think is where comes in the experts are really important, right? Making sure that we have the policy, advocacy, and knowledge experts to know the exact wording that's going to be within those laws, so that we're knowing that we're questioning the right things and that we're going to be pulling the right things along the way. So I just want to say that and make sure we really highlight that it's okay that it's okay if we have to go back, and it's expected almost that you have to revisit areas after you have completed them.
Absolutely. So defining the scope, we've been talking a lot about that, and, we thought scoping, just to kind of give a little definition, it means determining what to include in a project. Scoping is the initial step, and it's helpful to identify the question or questions the data set is looking to answer and outlines the parameter of the project.
Let me talk on that.
So as we go through the process, we're going to be scoping with Wendy. And here are some scoping questions that we can use to help us to narrow our project focus. And we can start thinking about the project to answer some common scoping questions. So what is the goal? Who is the audience? Are the laws accessible? And do we have the resources, which we just talked about, we do have the resources. And then the legal assessment or policy surveillance. So we had, we'll be talking about this more, but ours is going to be more on the legal assessment. I like always get those intertwined together.
And I don't think we really have to go into this one, but I thought it was just important to kind of hold a space that this is something we also are thinking about, right? So what does scoping look like for us? I kind of put this one in here thinking we were gonna have a big group that we could discuss. So it's not looking like that, but I think it would be important that we find another time that we can do that. And make sure everybody feels really good about all of these scoping questions. And I know obviously there's ways we've already done this. It's not like this is something that we get to fully do from the beginning, but there's parts that I think are really important that we nail down and make sure everybody feels great about. And everybody's included. Like Isla was saying, it's important that we have this, everybody feels involved in that we're doing the project that they want to be doing.
Absolutely. So this is going to reiterate what we've been talking about, redefining the scope. It's important to remember that the scoping process repeats and refines itself as we will work through the project. So we just wanted to just really reiterate that it's okay that we might come to a stopping point, might have to redefine the scope, and that it is non-linear. So during the scoping process, Wendy develops a clear statement of process that includes the topic she would like to study. Then she'll explore the legal landscape of the chosen topic by conducting background research. And then the steps include researching the relevant federal, state, and local laws. It also requires identifying the key issues addressed and any variations among jurisdictions. So now we're at the developing the coding questions. So after Wendy has finalized her background research and has her preliminary list of features, she'll be ready to develop the coding questions, which are the questions researchers use to capture and compare key features of the law. So when developing the coding questions, it's important to keep the goals of questions development in mind. One goal is to track and display the state of law through a question and answer format. The question and answer format used in a policy surveillance creates a data from law, which can then be compared with health outcome with health outcome data. Another goal is to create questions that measure the law through strict observation rather than interpretation. And then finally, if the end goal of building a legal data set is to determine what effect, if any, the laws have on health, you must write coding questions that mirror health outcomes. Remembering that questions can be edited, deleted, added throughout the creation of the legal data set.
Yeah, and I'll just make a note, and I think this is right, what we're talking about. The things I'll highlight, and I think we go into this a little more, but using the question and answer format helps us be objective when we're coding the law, which we'll get into, but it's important that, and I know, as Isla was saying, that it's hard to, your intentions are not very objective when you're doing research, but the questions can be, right? It's a question of, does this state have a law on distracted driving, right? Texting while driving. It has to be a yes or no. It has to be objective, so that when we get to the coding process, there isn't variations between those that are coding, and that it's very explicit in its outcome. And then we're making sure that those questions are also looking at the health outcome data that we're hoping to compare to, because we can't do one without the other. So again, with that mirror system that has to be happening.
So collecting the law, Wendy has now developed the questions for her project. Her team can only begin answering these questions, a process known as coding, once they have collected and organized the law. Collecting the law involves recording important information about the relevant laws for each jurisdiction in the project. One piece of important information is the legal citation. Here as New Jersey statute title 39, subtitle 1, the use, I'm sorry.
I think we go into this in the creating the law part too,
This part of
the what to record.
This is just pointing out where to look at it,
Mhm.
you know,
Yeah.
the important stuff. And then the effective date, which is what we have talked about before,
Mhm.
and then the history. So when collecting the laws, keep these these tips in mind. First, be sure to carefully review the terms of service of any legal database used. And then second, be sure to check for copyright restrictions on legal text. So then once Wendy's team collects the law, they can begin to organize the relevant sections into legal text. Because they are conducting a legal assessment, however, they would have one legal text for each jurisdiction, and all the text would be for one point in time.
So we would have 6, each of you would create your own legal text. So, and again, we've talked about how that might have to also include federal and state laws, because we're looking at water, which is not often mandated at these levels, but you would each health council will have their own legal text.
Right.
So, and this is one you'll play a big role in, right, is collecting and creating this legal text. And so in that process, which we will go into more when it comes to that point, but within the process of creating the legal text, you'll have daily research sheets, which will look differently depending on where your laws are stored, right? I know Sibla brought up the other day that they're not sure all of their laws are digital. So they can't be putting in their daily track sheet exactly the words they put in to search a law, right? Because they're looking in cabinets, they're not looking on a searchable database. So their daily sheet might have to look a little bit different, but basically the reason for doing this is that academic rigor that we were talking about is making sure all of this information is tracked, where you got it from, how you looked for it, what the results were, and then your notes, and you'll be keeping these daily so that it then turns into a master sheet, which is your legal text. So that it's gonna hold all of the relevant information of that law. Like we talked about, the statutory history, dates, implementation dates, all of those things, effective dates. And that will create your encompassed master sheet. And this was the one I talked about of, this is where you, a little closer, just because so you can see it, like this is, you'll collect your citations, your statutory history, the effective date, and then the body of the law as well. Any questions so far on the ether, Shelley?
Well, if anybody else thinks, oh, I'm the only one who hasn't heard this before.
No, there might be some in there.
I'm a little curious about why daily. I mean, I don't.
Yeah, and I'm just sure, I'm just.
Like every night.
Basically, yeah, this is a daily as in the time that you sit down to do it, not
Yeah.
daily as
Not
in.
actual
I
daily.
said that last training, I did this, no, just basically
It's a
saying,
log.
yeah,
I mean,
but saying that the time you sat down to do it, tracking.
dated log.
Yes, a log, tracking your log to put into the bigger sheet as opposed to just adding line by line to your master sheet. So not daily, if this was your entire job,
I
but
mean,
obviously not daily. I think we can change the name and just call it like a log sheet, right, or something, yeah, that's more like, but just trying to stress that we do
The
that,
process.
yeah, the
Yeah,
process that you
document the
took,
process.
right.
So I don't know if you want to answer this question now, but this whole notion of comparing 6 jurisdictions,
Mhm.
I have some questions and concerns about that. So I don't know if we want to, should we finish and then come back to that?
Yeah, we can finish, we really only have, I
Okay,
think.
why don't we finish
Yeah,
and
we
then come back to that
have
larger
Mhm.
structure?
Yeah, we only have 2 more steps to go through. And so that's gonna be coding the law. And this process is what Rebecca and I will do with Sue.
Great.
So coding the law refers to bringing question development and law collection together. Coding the law means using the text collected to answer the questions developed. And then here is an excerpt from Alaska's law regulating the use of electronic devices while driving. And the question is going to be, what behaviors are restricted while driving?
Objective.
Yes,
Right.
Right.
I have a great New Mexico example of this, by the way.
Oh, great,
Oh,
perfect.
That I did around school tobacco policy
Right.
that I could share.
So
Anyway.
So
Keep going.
handheld, right? We didn't go over the law, but if you go
Yes.
into it, if you go
Yeah.
back to it, it says, reading or typing a text message or other nonverbal messaging or communication, right? So that's what they're restricting there is handheld electronic messaging.
So then the publication and dissemination, as Wendy wraps up her legal data set, she must consider some questions related to publication and dissemination.
Which we will face, of course, but.
Yes. And now that Wendy has finished her legal mapping project, next her team must decide where to publish their data based on the target audience, the resources available, and the goals for the project. And then we're gonna stop that out.
Yeah.
Is that the end?
Mhm.
Which I will say a note on step 8, this would be much post this project. And also a thing to note about step 8 is that once you start doing step 8 of tracking the law, so you track the iterations of the laws you've already banked. So you have your legal text that you've created on this topic. If you chose to continue to track any iterations or updates to those laws, you could do so, but it would then turn it into a policy surveillance project as opposed to a legal assessment.
So just to follow this example,
Mhm.
I saw the example of looking at the laws and you selected, there's one piece about it covered the handheld devices. I didn't see the question about the health impacts and how it was integrated into this example. I mean, it's pretty obvious to me that you would want to be in terms of public health impacts, how many people die in a motor vehicle related crashes. So just using this example, where in the legal mapping is a correlation between this law and that public health outcome. I mean, I think it's pretty simplistic here that we're trying to avoid crashes.
Mhm.
You could use crashes or deaths.
And I think that goes back to the point of legal mapping as part of it, right? So it's the collecting the law part.
So why would you personally.
Publish
like,
just that, but that's something that is done, where that's looking at just the variations. But that's again, going back to the point of the change and the action part of it, of like the advocacy and the change, why you should do the research in the first place. But you know, you could do an entire assessment of just the law and not connect it back.
Is that
the
what we're
outcomes.
going to be doing?
No, we're gonna be, but this part of the process, right? It's
how we're gonna get the evidence.
is the law process.
And then Isla's.
Go ahead, Isla.
Yeah, sorry, I hope it's okay to jump in.
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely.
Most of my work in practice was doing just the legal research, because the health outcome data is can be so difficult to come by for our particular legal questions. Sometimes we didn't have our team of experts, and so sometimes our publishing just the legal data meant that another researcher could go and take if they could go collect the health outcome data, or we didn't know it existed, but they had it, and so they were able to do it. And you can still make some conclusions or policy points about these laws, even if you're not doing a scientific evaluation. You just have to use the data differently. If I haven't done a regression analyses, I can't say definitively that these laws have this kind of impact, but I can say generally that states like Rhode Island are seeing much lower rates, and I can do that by looking at that information, but acknowledging that it's not a regression analysis. So I think there's actually, because the legal research is so difficult to collect, I think there's a real appetite for that, even if it's independent of the health outcome data.
And to that point, I think, right, like, we can talk about this. We definitely, I don't believe that and I think, Sue, this is probably what you were trying to talk about earlier, was that this funding particularly is not to look at the scientific correlation between a health outcome and the law, because that will require doing an entire health research, right? So we could do it more of the implications, right? Of like, we see these health outcomes in this area could correlate to this law that we're looking at, right? So maybe it's not a cause, and we're not able to prove a cause based on the law, but we can, with the research we've done on both health and the law, make recommendations that the law is impacting this health outcome that we're seeing, right? So if we're seeing a really high rate of lead in the water, that's causing really bad health outcomes. This lack of policy existing, right? This lack of law existing to regulate lead, right? Like, that can then say we're having this health outcome could be impacted by changing this law.
Do we have any other questions?
Sue, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I'm thinking that when you're talking about recommendations, it's really more like hypotheses. Like, we see this going on with in the community around health effects that correlate with lead. And you can talk about those as hypotheses. And you're right, that's what I was talking about when I said as I understand our goal, we're not actually going to do the research necessarily of the kind that Isla was talking about, because that takes that would take someone, if not a full biostatistician, someone more like me who can use multivariate analyses and come up with intervening or mediating variables and plausible rival hypotheses and all that kind of stuff. It would be the kind of thing you see in a public health journal. But for us, we can catalog the law and then point to things that we think ought to be studied in the future. And I think that's where you might be going with this.
that disappoint, satisfy?
I mean, I'm here to learn about the project. It's, yeah, I don't know. So the next area of question I have is about this issue of comparing. And also, you know, and this is something Geraldine, maybe you could speak to as well. You know, I'm new to working with Santa Clara Pueblo, but data sovereignty is absolutely essential to them. I have never really discussed, and I don't know, how our pueblos feel about sharing policies. So has that been discussed with the tribes that are involved in this project? Is that something that they are comfortably sharing their tribal policies? Yeah, where do things stand with that?
Yeah.
Because there are tremendous, you know, privacy considerations and ownership considerations. So I don't know if you have thoughts about that, or Geraldine, or any of you as you know, engaged with the tribes in this project. I'm curious what the attitudes or policies are, and you know, how we're looking at that.
Carolyn, do you have any thoughts before I go?
Yeah, thanks, Shelley, for raising that question. I think I wish Iris and someone from San Ildefonso was on this call, because I think to your question, I would not be able to speak on behalf of any of the tribes on their thoughts with that. And so I think moving forward, that should directly come from tribal leadership and the health councils that are involved. So I think I'll end with that and just pass it to Rebecca.
Yeah, and I mean, to that point, nothing has been written, right, to say, yes, absolutely, but it was the intention of this project, but that did not, at that point, involve getting this approval from tribal leadership to assess the policy, right? They got approval from tribal leadership to engage in this project, to go down this processes, but the actual agreeance of assessing the policies is something that is still needing to be worked on.
And I think to do that, again, and I guess that relates to then, are we looking at comparing the 6 communities that are involved? Kind of what, you know, as we dive in, some policies will be state level. Obviously, we'll all share, and I don't know whether you're going to do that work at the state level. Some, again, as we've mentioned, maybe county, or, you know, I think county level. But when we start looking at the specific community level or tribal approaches, especially to something like water systems that people have control over, are we going to be, what are we doing, kind of cross community analysis? Are we looking at what's going on statewide? What's the intent of how it's going to be used, I guess? But I'm still struggling to understand.
Yeah, and I think the idea is to assess the combination, right? Of course, we're not doing this full health outcome research, but it's assessing if we're seeing a difference in these health outcomes in jurisdictions that maybe have a policy existing for lead. Is there a policy that regulates the amount of lead that's allowed to be in the water? Is that going to be at the state level? Is that going to be in the county level? And that's where I think Sue's coming in very about the mixed methods approach, right? Like, this might not just come down to law. This might come down to community story, to focus groups, to talking about these things. But the idea is to look at if there's a difference existing within these laws across these jurisdictions, is that impacting the health of those? And if we're comparing, right, but just kind of looking across of, you could consider these individual studies on their own, right? But we're taking them in a collection to see what the variations are in health and law across all 6, to see if maybe there's something implemented in one area that could really work in another area.
You know, I'm just thinking about, so first, let's just take it into the COVID realm. You know, and different communities have experienced different impacts from COVID. And I think there's been tremendous hesitancy to even lift to look at differences, let alone the policy. I mean, this is just, I really, I'm just aware this is very sensitive here. So I think you know that, we know that, and, you know, I really look forward to, obviously, Ken will be part of this conversation and the tribal leadership will, because hopefully we can do it in a way that people feel like they're, I mean, they may or may not be comfortable sharing what those health risks and outcomes are at the tribal level. County level, data is available, it's very different. So, you know, that's public.
Right.
In general, so.
And,
there
right, and
may be
that's,
things to learn from counties also that can be applied or help tribal systems as we compare those.
yeah, and I mean, at least from the funder, it seems like just having this tribal involvement is amazing. So if that doesn't, we run into barriers of being able to really
Right.
do this, but I think the idea is back to the point of doing maybe that mixed methods approach, that you're still getting this. Maybe they're not comfortable sharing their policies, but they're comfortable sharing their health outcomes. So then we can look at surrounding policy to then say it's core, it's also being present here, right? Or maybe they're willing to or maybe they're willing to provide qualitative data, but not quantitative data. So then we can show, and I think the stories we keep hearing, right? Of, well, I'm terrified because our trash is overflowing and that is causing contaminated water, right? That is contaminating our water every day. We can't find that in either health outcomes or in the law, right? So though that's where, and Sue talks about this all the time, every time we have shared stories like this with her, of we can't lose that, right? Like that is this central point in this process. So it's looking at it from that mindset of ensuring that we're talking about all of this at the same time. And if we can show that in law and health outcome data and back it up with qualitative data, I mean, what more could you want, right? Isn't that always the hope, is to have this, a mixed methods approach that holds the stories and the quantitative aspects. But yeah, I mean, and that's something, as we know, it's a sensitive subject. It's not something we're trying to push by any means. So we want to make the process work the way that it can work, that everybody involved is happy.
And I'm glad you said that, how it can work, because, you know, one of the things that Iris did say is they do have this data that she would, you know, would like to know, how do I use it? So even if it's just, here's how you could use your data, it doesn't necessarily have to go to that level if they don't want it to.
Yeah.
You know, so that's the great thing about this project, is that it's your project. It's you know, how can we help you? That's really the goal and the focus. So.
Yeah, and that's especially with the publication and dissemination, like that's going to be a conversation we have to have of how widely everyone involved is willing to share this information, and that's up to you. We don't have this high level of requirement. We don't have to have a published paper. We don't have to have an academic paper at the end of this.
Right.
So it's going to look like, but that part to me is so important of that's where this actual change in policy, in attitude, in law is going to come to fruition, is during that dissemination point of getting everyone involved in the process and then getting them really excited about actually changing something at the end.
And then one of the puzzles also stated, you know, dissemination can be advocacy, you know, disseminating within your community. You know, it does not necessarily have to be at a specific level as well.
That flexibility, that seems
Absolutely.
Good.
All right, any other questions?
Stu, got any final thoughts?
Oh, sorry, I'm getting my sound working. No, I don't think I have any final thoughts. I think I'll have more as we begin this work and we see where we get.
Absolutely, thank you.
And Emily, I'm not sure how much you've been listening, but and I'm really putting you on the spot here, but any thoughts on health outcome data and kind of ways that you've seen in this process we could implement it Does that feel really hard to you? Anything of that sort?
Um, for the tribes, a little harder to get some of that health outcome data unless they have the connection established. Which it sounds like that a lot of them do from what I'm hearing. And so that shouldn't be an issue. I did see earlier someone mentioned like, you know, maybe being able to use the data a little bit more, like if it might be through visuals or some kind of a portal to access it. I don't know what that form looks like, but if it's like, okay, we've got data, but we're not really sure what to do with it or how to tie it back to this process. I mean, I think that's definitely something that we have the capacity on our team to do.
Great.
Mhm.
And the other really good thing I will note is that everybody is, at least on some capacity, all of the pueblos involved have recently done or are doing a community health assessment with Aztec. So it might look like needing to look at some of that data, and maybe that's, again, maybe this is back to just keeping it internal. That's not something we're going to publish. That's not something we're going to disseminate outside of this information. And we can work through what that process needs to look like, of whether it's okay if these laws are looked at, but it's not okay if they're shared. That's okay, right? Like, then that's fine. We can work on that. We can come up with ways of sharing what we found without any identifying information being on it.
That's great. I mean, I think the fact that all three pueblos that are involved share the Rio Grande and you know, I think it's very exciting part of this project.
Absolutely.
That there's those internal relationships as well.
Right.
Yeah.
Great.
All right.
Well, I think that is it.
I actually
Yeah.
have one more question, and that
Sure.
relates to climate change. I think it's important to all of us, I think the people who certainly know for Ken, I think I can speak for him in this, that the work we're doing continue to be linked to climate change, adaptation, resilience,
Yeah.
and health impacts. And, you know, I think as, you know, we've identified some of those original 5 topics are more easily, you know, that obviously the relationship between public water systems, contaminants, and health is obvious. But keeping that, I want to encourage us to keep that climate change at heart.
Yeah.
Because whether it's lead or trap, those really aren't climate change.
Right.
Health issues, there's huge health issues. And my public health, you know, but I'm kind of want to hold that awareness, because I think that's part, you know, there's many different goals of this project that that's
Yeah.
part.
And I think that, and I agree, and I think we can absolutely keep that along the process of doing this, but I know you've heard me say this, Shelley, and everybody that will be watching the recording of, if you have the capacity with this funding to do additional things, like create a climate change subcommittee, create a climate crisis initiative, you are what, right? Like if maybe we do focus in on this area that is an environmental health, human health correlation, but maybe you're not connecting it as strongly to climate change. We are fully on board of continuing this work of, especially I think in a lot of areas, making that community connection between climate change and your own health. Like that is something we're both very passionate about, continuing with this grant of ensuring that we're getting educational materials, hosting events, anything like that to try to continue this connection of issue, right? Like,
Great. Well, you know, that has happened. I mean, at Santa Clara, we have a climate change and environmental health subcommittee. So I really appreciate your saying that this is one piece, but it doesn't have to be all of the work at all. And that CCHICA really supports that broader.
right, yeah. And
I'm so glad I raised
yeah, Quay, for example, they're doing an entire climate health and mental health. So how is the climate's health impacting your mental health? And they're doing all of that under this funding. They're like
wonderful, and I look forward to hearing more sharing from different groups, because that is, I mean, I know there's multiple goals of this.
Yeah, right.
You know, and that's a really important.
Couldn't agree more.
Absolutely.
Great.
All right.
Okay.
Well, thank you everyone for attending. Thank you interns.